Today, with great honor, we welcome to Visualfy Vinton Cerf, Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist for Google. Vinton is one of the fathers of Internet, as you all probably know, and he's also founder of the international movement of changemakers, People-Centered Internet, created to ensure that Internet continues to improve people's lives and being a positive force for good. Good morning, Vinton. It is a pleasure for Visualfy to have you here. Thanks so much for such a great opportunity to share time with you, and thank you for helping us remind young people with hearing loss that you can be whatever you want, even Vice President of Google. I am Maria Jose Millán, in charge of marketing at Visualfy, and he's Manel Alcaide, co-founder of Visualfy. As you know, we are a startup formed by deaf and hearing people that creates technology for people with hearing loss and companies committed to accessibility.
Well, I think back in the 1970s when Bob Kahn and I did the original design, we were focused on a problem that the American Defense Department was trying to solve, which is how to use computers in command and control. So we were focused on an engineering problem. But it was very clear, even in the predecessor system called ARPANET, which was a test to see if we could get different brands of computers talking to each other on a homogeneous network. It was very clear that the engineers who were using it saw this in addition to its technical potential. You could see the social effects of this thing. We created electronic mail. We had mailing lists. We had people discussing, who were the best science fiction writers and where were the best restaurants. So it was very clear as the internet was being designed and built that there was a social component to it. And it also had a rather direct impact, or it's a implication for people with hearing impairment, because a lot of the communication on the net was textual, it was written by email and chat and things like that. So from my point of view, as a person with a hearing impairment, having a network that catered to an alternative way of communicating was really very welcome. And so I could see some of that, but the idea that this would become a global system at the scale it is was not assured. But I will say that when Bob and I were doing the design, we anticipated that it would have to be global in scope in order to serve the military application, because the Defense Department had to be able to operate anywhere in the world. So in some sense, we tried to account for that in the design. That's not the same as having nearly 4 billion people online, though. That's an evolution which is the consequence of its utility in a variety of social and private sector and public sector ways, and also enormous private sector investment. None of this would be at the scale it currently is without that. So there was a private sector motivation which came much later, probably in the late 1980s and early 1990s, particularly as Tim Berners-Lee and the World Wide Web emerge out of this cauldron of innovation. Well, an example of one of the things I do is interviews like this over the net, actually quite often. And I'm frequently doing little videos and things like that, which I send to conferences that I'm unable to attend in person. So part of my job, in a sense, is to be present in a variety of different venues, sometimes in person and sometimes remotely in this way. In fact, I'll be in Barcelona in a couple of days to celebrate an award from the Catalonian government. So I travel a great deal, about 80% of my time. I often go to places where there isn't any internet in order to encourage people to build the infrastructure that's needed. I spend a significant part of my time on policy associated with the internet, whether it's the social impacts of the internet and how we cope with some of the negative behaviors that we see, or the positive benefits of the internet, where we see improved electronic commerce, we see new jobs being created, new businesses being created on top of the internet infrastructure. So I have a policy role to play. And since I'm at Google, which is a high-tech company, I spend a chunk of my time on technical matters, trying to understand how do we improve the way the system works, what new things can we build on top of it, and particularly at Google, where we keep expanding the range of products and services that we offer. Now we're in the hardware business. You know, we make mobile phones, we make Google Home appliance devices, other Internet of Things devices. So I can't imagine a more fun job than the one I have because I get to pay attention to so many different things that are associated with the Internet. So accessibility is a very important term, and we should take it as broadly as we can. We have possibly the most flexible device ever invented. It's called the computer. It will do anything that we can program it to do. So there really aren't any limits except our imagination and our ability to write software. And yet, in spite of that, we often find that the applications that are available to us on our laptops, our desktops, our mobiles, our pads are not very satisfactory when it comes to accessibility. And I'm not happy about that. It turns out it is not so easy to decide and figure out how to design an application that will be accessible or can be made accessible to someone with some range of vision impairment, some range of hearing impairment, some range of motor impairment, some range of cognitive impairment. As a designer of an application, you have to think about the design at the very beginning on the presumption it must be accessible to everyone. So, how do I design this application so that it can adapt to the kinds of accommodations that are needed for accessibility? Not everyone who is designing and programming has an intuition about how to do that design. So we really are suffering right now from a lack of depth of understanding of what practices and techniques make things accessible. There is a tendency to design and build a product or a service and then try to overlay accessibility on top of it. An example of this would be screen readers, which understand HTML of the World Wide Web and try to voice what is on the screen. And I can say that that's very unsatisfactory in many respects because the designers of the web pages that are being voiced didn't think about how do I present this two-dimensional information in a serial way, since if it's voiced, you can't do it all at once. So I'm a huge fan of deeper research into gaining insight into what makes things accessible. But at the same time, I'm rather encouraged by the flexibility of programmable devices to adapt to people's needs. So we need to work harder to build accessibility frameworks that will cooperate with the user to do this kind of adaptation. Uh, so we still have a long way to go. I am a noisy voice at Google on this topic, and I will continue to be a noisy voice on this topic until I'm satisfied that we have figured out how to do a good job of making our products accessible. So I have two examples for you that I want to encourage the people you work with to think about. There are two deaf people at Google that I've worked with. One of them, his name is Ken Herenstein. Ken is deaf and signs. He's the guy that worked really hard to get captions on YouTube videos automatic captioning. And built into this, by the way, is a way of downloading the captions that have been generated by a computer, and then you can edit them to fix the mistakes, and then upload them again so that you have high quality captions. So a deaf guy led that effort, and I think that makes a lot of good sense. The second guy is Dmitry Kanevsky, and Dmitry is a born deaf Russian speaker who now is one of our employees, speaks English as well, but he has a very heavy accent. Uh, he has developed automatic captioning or automatic transcription in several applications. So the first one is an application that runs in your mobile, and it takes the speech in that it hears, and then it puts text up. You get on your mobile scrolling along. He built that because he needed it at meetings and conferences where he couldn't hear, but he was having conversations with people. This works in, I don't know, 40, 50 different languages. And so you can pick a primary and secondary language and switch back and forth between them. So that's one beautiful application. But even more exciting application is that we have a video conferencing capability that we call Google Meets. And in the Google Meet system, we now have the ability to automatically caption whatever anyone is saying in the conference. So you might have a group of people who are 10, 12, 15 people communicating. Whatever anyone says is captioned at the bottom of the screen automatically in the Google Meet system. That's a very new capability that's drawing on our success using machine learning for the ability to do speech understanding and speech recognition. So the technology of machine learning has advanced dramatically over the last decade to the point now where we can do a very good job of understanding speech and, of course, generating speech. So we have devices like Google Home and the like that can speak. Now, of course, we need to have those same devices captioning the responses that come back. And so we have, in addition to our smart speaker, we also have a display-based Google Home device so that it can speak back in text form as well. Well, yes. I mean, I'm a huge fan of technology. I wouldn't be where I am if I weren't. Just to clarify one thing, my wife Sigrid was actually born with normal hearing, but she lost it when she was 3 so from spinal meningitis. The reason that's important is that she is what is called postlingually deaf, which meant that she could hear, she could speak, she had auditory memory. That turns out to be rather important because when she finally had a cochlear implant 50 years later, the brain had not forgotten its auditory learning, and so she very, very quickly adapted to the implant's function within like 20 minutes or so of turning this on, activating it for the first time. She picked up the phone and we talked to each other on the phone for the first time in our 30 years of marriage. She's had subsequently had a second implant 10 years later, and then more recently, one of the implants failed, and we had another reimplant, which has also been successful. The other thing which is happening is that the technology of speech processors that go with cochlear implants have also improved over time. And so we watched her right ear implant performing better than ever because we got new speech processors to go with it. So, and you can imagine, I'm a huge fan of technology that will augment our human capabilities, either to bring them up to nearly normal or even to surpass ordinary and normal human capabilities. So we don't need to stop at the normal human capacity. Think for just a minute about being able to hear what dogs hear at 20,000 cycles a second. Maybe we wouldn't want to, but that would be, you could do that. Or to see with X-rays, to see with infrared, to see with ultraviolet, uh, to improve our vision, not only to correct blindness, but maybe even to see like a microscope does. So I have this excitement about electronic and neural interfaces that allow us to bring new capabilities to the human intellect. I'd like to go on just a little bit on this topic because a very important pair of researchers in history, J.C.R. Licklider at MIT and Douglas Engelbart at SRI International, were both convinced in the 1950s that computers could be used to augment human intellect. And whenever you do a Google search today, whenever you use Google Translate, whenever you are watching a video and seeing an automatic caption, you're using artificial intelligence. You're using computer capability to augment your own capacity. And so at Google, we see all of these things as tools to improve our own ability to function, to do things that we couldn't do on our own. So I'm very excited about that potential. But I have to say that I'm also very concerned about becoming dependent on those technologies or having the technologies turned against us. And so in the internet world, for example, especially in social networking, you can see how one person can use computers and botnets, for example, to leverage their particular point of view to make it appear that tens of thousands of people think the way they do. This is a kind of augmented disinformation and misinformation, which is harmful, to say nothing of denial of service attacks and malware attacks and other kinds of things. So we end up realizing that technology is a two-edged sword and it can be abused. And so, in addition to finding ways to improving our lives using the technology, we also have to cope with people who try to use that technology for harmful purposes. And so that is a big challenge. It's a social and economic challenge that we must confront, not solvable purely with technology. Yes, I'm already. You're preaching to the converted because I believe that companies that offer products and services should be thinking about the full range of need of the population on the planet, and that includes people with disabilities. Now, let me try to modulate this a little bit. As you both know, disabilities come in a variety of different flavors, so to speak. Deafness varies from repairable with a hearing aid or an amplifier to needing a cochlear implant, and we can make the same argument for various forms of visual impairment. It is likely that not every product can meet and can adapt to the needs of every form of disability, especially in very extreme cases. So the question is, what should we do about that? And one answer is to design and build products that have standardized interfaces so that if we want to or need to, we can build a device which is specific to a particular user's disability and then makes use of some standard interface in order to manage and control an application. So standardization could be our friend here, where we use a device which is specialized to our needs and then interfaces to an application. So I can see responsibilities ranging from the product maker actually doing everything possible to deal with accessibility accommodation or standardizing interfaces to let another person or another company provide even more refined capability of adapting to a particular user's need. But we should incorporate all of that thinking into our product development. Within the company, we've established what we call Google accessibility ratings, from 1 to 4, and we try to build our products so that they are maximally accessible. We still have a ways to go to even understand how to do that, let alone actually doing it. But there is a great deal of attention being paid inside the company. We have a central group that is focused on accessibility. They have correspondence, so to speak, with the various product areas that Google is working on in order to help them improve their implementation of accessibility mechanisms. So for people with hearing impairments, I think we push pretty far along in automatic speech recognition and display technology. But we want to address an even broader range of disabilities than just hearing impairment. So we are just continuing to work on making our products more accessible, specifically for people with hearing impairments. At some point, for example, we should be able to support real-time translation of languages in a visible way, so that if one person is speaking Russian and someone else is speaking English, they both can see the text of what is being said in the language of choice. And so a good example would be two deaf people speaking two different languages, both communicating because their mobiles are doing the translation and presenting a display of the speech. I mean, that gets me all excited about being able to help people over that barrier. So I think that probably the most important technology to become visible is machine learning. The ability to build multi-layer neural networks that can be adapted to applications, including speech understanding, speech recognition, speech translation, um, all of those kinds of image recognition, for example, navigation, helping a blind person know what's going on, what is in my surrounding, situational awareness, things like that. Self-driving cars make heavy use of machine learning in addition to other things. So that's a particularly notable computer development over the last decade or so. Looking forward into the future, one of the things which we are becoming increasingly capable of doing is interfacing computing devices or electronic devices to our neural systems. So a cochlear implant is a good example of a sensory neural interface with electronics. We're seeing similar kinds of work in optical devices that store vision. We can see sensory motor possibilities for people who have lost the control of their arms and legs because of a spinal injury. There may be ways of propagating the nerve signals through a device uh, so as to regain control over limbs. We're seeing extraordinary work for people with loss of limbs using neural interfaces as opposed to mechanical ones in order to control artificial limbs. So I'm very excited about the sensory neural, sensory no motor capabilities coming in the near future. Looking much farther into the future and much more speculative is the possibility of a cognitive interfaces between computing devices and our brains, for example. As I get older, I notice that I forget things more. And so what I need is an augmented memory. And I'm hoping someday I'll have a little memory implant that I can connect. I think this kind of cognitive interface is extremely speculative. It's very much science fiction right now because we don't really understand how the brain stores memory and how we could make it notable or noticeable. How could we take a computer with memory in it and draw your conscious attention to that memory, other than the way we do it now, which is put the information in a computer, or do a Google search, which is my way of recovering memory loss. So that's very speculative in the far future, but it's not out of the range of possibility given how much we have learned over the past 50 to 100 years about how our human bodies work. So we actually have two things going on. We are, along with other people, have been exploring whether it's possible to have sign recognition, image recognition. It requires a very high quality video stream that isn't broken up or anything. Because you have to be able to see motions that are rather quick, and those you. I'm not a signer myself, but I've watched people signing, and I'm amazed at how quickly they are able to communicate using signing. So we're still some ways away, I think, from a reliable ability to do this. Typically, you end up wearing a glove of some sort so that the computer can figure out where your fingers are. Microsoft, for example, has the Wii, W-I-I and I forget what they call it, but there are devices that can figure out, where is your body positioned. But I think it's not running fast enough to do a very good job for signing. There is another interesting thing is that people who are born deaf often have difficult speech. The speech is hard to understand. And so we've even gone to the trouble of training our machine learning models to understand this particular kind of deaf speech and then translate it and generate more normal speech from that. And so it might help someone whose ability to articulate is somehow limited, and to provide better quality speech sound by use of machine learning and voice generation. So that's another attempt to bring someone whose situation is not satisfactory to the point where it's easier to interact with the general public. Well, I certainly hope that that you're successful in this effort. And of course, I'm a big fan of these kinds of research programs in the hope that they will produce usable outcomes that improve the lives of people with hearing impairment. Well, thanks so much for letting me join you today. I really appreciate it. And of course, I will be happy to reinforce your message, which is that technology can help. We just need to put our minds to it.